So our last snippet for this week is going to look at the 2000 election and constitutional history, and this is a disputed election, which in some ways has set the tone, I think, for our continuing debates over election law and heated debates between the parties. This is a fluky election, which ultimately does come down to election procedures. As we'll see, there are some ways in which Al Gore, if you counted the votes in Florida, would have won. In some ways, George W. Bush, if you count the votes in Florida, he would have won. But there are a variety of paths to get there. So this is a race between the Vice President Al Gore and the Democratic Vice Presidential nominee Joe Lieberman, who will eventually, 8 years later, endorse Republican candidate for President John McCain. The Republicans nominate George W. Bush and former Defense Secretary Dick Cheney. Gore proves to be an uninspiring candidate, even though the economy is doing quite well. There's a relatively peaceful era. He runs well behind Bush until very late in the campaign, when it's revealed that Bush, who had admitted that he had a problem with alcohol in the 1970s, but didn't admit that he had been arrested for a DUI offense near his father's summer home in Maine. And so that news breaks several days before the election. Gore suddenly tightens the margins. There are a couple of factors that then shape the result. So this is the final result, where Gore wins more votes, the popular votes, than Bush, but the overall electoral vote margin very narrowly goes to Bush, because he wins the Florida's, as we'll see, disputed vote. Now, the sort of fun of the backwater things here. The first is that Gore loses both President Clinton's home state of Arkansas and the vice president's home state of Tennessee. This is part of a broader shift in the Appalachian South towards the Republicans. But if Gore had carried his home state or the president's home state, he would have been elected regardless of what happened in Florida. Gore also loses New Hampshire, whose 4 electoral votes, if they had gone to him rather than to Bush, Gore would have gotten 270, Bush would have gotten 267. It wouldn't have mattered what happened in Florida. And the New Hampshire defeat was in large measure due to the campaign of this man, Ralph Nader, who ran as the Green Party candidate in 2000, very aggressively campaigned against Gore and siphoned votes away from Gore, and ultimately, I think, cost Gore both Florida and New Hampshire. So absent the Nader campaign, we never would have heard about all of these disputes in Florida. There's one other thing that went on. Palm Beach County, Florida, devises this crazy ballot scheme where people punch their they have a little stylus pen, and they punch their ballot through these little punch buttons here. But as you can see, rather than listing the candidates just on one side, they decide to list the candidates in somewhat larger print from one side to another. So we have Bush, Cheney, as the 3, which makes the most sense. But then the Gore Lieberman ticket is the 5. So if you're a Gore Lieberman voter, it's not hard to imagine where at least some of these voters, a lot of very old voters in Palm Beach County, might vote for. But the 4 punch here is for the Reform Party ticket, Pat Buchanan and Izola Foster. Buchanan, remember we countered him in the Nixon administration. By this point, he's drifted way to the right, and he runs in 2000 as this sort of far right populist candidate. He has a background in there's a sense that Buchanan doesn't really like Jewish people very much, and yet in this overwhelmingly Democratic, quite Jewish county, he gets several thousand votes. Almost certainly these votes are, or most of these votes are, accidental votes, people who thought they were voting for Gore and Lieberman but ultimately punched their ballot for Buchanan. But that can't be changed. So the Gore people, as the election results come in, are are convinced, not without reason, that probably a majority of voters in Florida who went to vote wanted to vote for him. But that's not how the count comes in. The count comes in with a very narrow a very narrow Bush lead that are under 2,000 votes. That then drops even further after each county checks their ballots to only several hundred votes. At this point, there becomes an additional factor. The Secretary of State in Florida, which is an elected office in the state, this woman, Katherine Harris, pushes counties to very quickly complete their counting so she can certify the votes. But Harris was sort of wearing two hats. On the one hand, she's the state's elected chief elected officer in charge of the election process, but she was also Bush's co-chair. And there's this sense that maybe she's sort of, more sympathetic to Bush than the approach. This is a clip from the film Recount. Harris is played by Laura Dern, and the sense here is that Dern was actually underplaying Harris to a certain extent. She's not she's an intriguing figure.
Don't you worry, Mac. It's going to take a lot more than David Letterman making fun of my hair and makeup to knock me down.
That is exactly why I backed your campaign when everyone else ran over to Mortham, because you are a woman of action.
A woman of action, like Queen Esther.
Queen Esther?
I have been reading my Bible quite a bit here lately, and I have been feeling this unusually strong kinship with Queen Esther. You recall Queen Esther? She was willing to sacrifice herself to save the lovely Jewish people. And that's exactly what I'm doing right now. And if I perish, I perish.
So this is the woman in charge of Florida's election approach. It's not the most straightforward matter, and so the count is certified in Bush's favor, and Gore then seeks a recount. I mean, to me, one of the important things, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about Bush versus Gore in the discussion sections, but that both parties are trying to manipulate the system in Florida. Under the law, Gore had the right to seek a recount in every single county in the state, but he does not do that. Instead, he only seeks a recount in 4 counties. These 3 southern counties, heavily Democratic, Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach, and a central Florida county called Volusia County, where Gore had done pretty well. So it seems like what Gore is doing is kind of cherry picking, and he only wants Democratic counties to recount their votes, hoping that will bump up his total because he only lost by a few hundred votes, but not counting Republican counties. This turns out to be a catastrophic tactical mistake by Gore for 2 reasons. First, it creates the impression, frankly, I think the accurate impression, that he's kind of why doesn't he want to count everyone's vote the same? Secondly, as we'll see, it turns out that even in some of these deep red counties, a full recount would have benefited Gore, but this is the choice that they make. And then each of the 4 counties chooses a slightly different method in terms of how to handle the recount. And the most famous of these occurred in Palm Beach County. This is a photograph of the Palm Beach County recount. Remember, this was the one where they had to punch the ballot with the stylus pen. And the question became what to do with these indentations. These, as the country learned, indentation in a ballot is called a chad. And the way the Palm Beach County system worked, you were supposed to, punch your stylus pen down. Full the way through the ballot, then you'd submit the ballot, and the electronic ballot counter, if you punched it fully through, would you'd have you'd have no paper left in the hole, and it would count your vote. But if you didn't punch quite hard enough, the result would be, well, the paper might be hanging, the so-called Chad might be hanging, and the vote might not be counted. Now, some of these, like this one that I'm circling here, the intent here is obvious. This person wanted to vote for whoever, let's say that was a Gore voter. They wanted to vote for Gore, their vote should be counted. But what happened, and you see the guy looking with a microscope to figure out, where you had cases where a Chad was very, very slightly indented, but not even broken from the paper. In sometimes these votes were counted, and sometimes they were not. The Bush people go to court. They say we want to stop this, and the Bush legal team, which is headed by this man, Ted Olson, outmaneuvers the Gore legal team, which is headed by this man, David Boies, and ultimately in Bush versus Gore, we'll talk more about this in our discussion. The Supreme Court, by a 5-4 vote, rules in favor of Bush and stops the recount. So who would have won? Well, the final count is Bush by 537 votes. 2 counties, Palm Beach and Miami-Dade, don't even complete their recount. What Gore was requesting, which was remember, he had requested only these 4 heavily Democratic counties. If the Supreme Court had ruled differently and had said, all right, these recounts can go forward, Bush still would have won. It would have been by a much reduced margin, but he still would have won by 225 votes. One of the ironies here is that if Gore had asked for a recount of every county in the state, which again he did not ask for, so this was never on the table, and each county had developed their own standards to count, Gore would have won the state by 171 votes, and ultimately would have been elected. This doesn't happen. So the key result here, and I think when we see all of these tight battles over election laws now, like what we're now seeing in Georgia, Democrats and Republican election lawyers are both remembering what happened here in Florida. In this case, interpretation of state election law ultimately did decide who would be president of the United States. And that's it for our snippets for this week.